All right, so once we kind of conceptualize an extension as just the elaboration of your argument, right? And then providing argumentative options or outlets to the ballot based on your extension, we can then categorize these components into two different general ideas, right? The first component, which is what is your argument, has really like three sections that you can kind of think of, right? The first section is like signposting. And we talked about that yesterday, just labeling where is your argument, right? And I'll give an example in a second, actually, but just keep that in mind. The second is labeling your argument, which is what is the title that you want the judge to remember or write down, right? And the third is explaining your argument. So your claim, warrant, and impact, and just reiterating exactly what your argument is. So this might sound something like, off my first contention, extend the like X author, right? And that's like your label, or extend the threat of violence argument, right? Which is what the argument we talked about yesterday. Violent revolutions create the threat of violence, which forces the oppressor to reconcile with the oppressed groups, blah, 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 like claim, warrant, impact, right? So that would be like kind of just the first component, right? The second component, which I think a lot of people kind of miss, and which is like just as important really, is the implication, right? So again, like just, do people remember what offense and defense are? Like, let's just, come on, let's get someone really quickly. What is offense? What is defense? We're gonna keep going back to this. Come on, y'all, we're gonna have to pick on people if there's nobody who volunteers. Offense?
Offense is like why you are able to win, and then defense is why your opponent is wrong or why you didn't lose.
Yes, exactly. So an offensive implication, right, could be your opponent, I'm sorry, your argument turns or outweighs your opponent, right? So you have an extension, right, that ensures that not only is your opponent like bad, right, but you are actively better than them. That is, you turn their argument, right, or you outweigh their argument, indicating that your impact is more important, right? A defensive extension or an implication is going to usually like preclude or take out your opponent's argument. So it's saying that, look, because of this argument that I have, your argument is not true, right? Your argument has been taken out, or your argument doesn't matter as much, right? So those are kind of like the implications. And you can kind of remember that with this acronym called POT. So like preclude, which is your extension coming prior to your opponent's argument, outweigh, which we'll talk about more, but really just your impact matters more than your opponent, right? And then turn, again, like the opposite of your opponent's argument is true because your extension, and then finally takes out. So your extension means that your opponent's logic is wrong. Cool? So make sure you do POT. And in round, that's like a very, very great sort of mechanism to make sure that you're covering all your bases. Questions? Okay. We're gonna stop for questions, but I want to show an example of an extension really quickly so that people can kind of like just get the idea of like what this looks like. So here I have like a sample extension, right? This is the piece of evidence that we were reading, and that would have been in the 1NC. The first negative constructive speech says, the topic is like, I'm actually just not going to go into like the details of this topic because it was about like basically like military aid and like offering like assistance to other countries with like military weapons and aid and like all that kind of stuff. But basically, right, you have like the typical structure of an extension all kind of labeled here, right? So you have the signposting, which is off the PMC's disad. And this is basically like the position or the off-case argument that the extension is referring to, right? This is very similar to thinking like, well, off of the PMC's contention, like same thing, right? PMCs is really just standing for private military contractors. So it's an acronym that is used in this topic and the literature. After that, you would say extend the circumvention link. The circumvention argument is the label for this particular argument. And then that gives the judge a clear idea of what to write down on the flow, right? And then after your label, right, you explain the claim. So the argument is that banning military aid allows assistance to be rerouted and outsourced to private contractors, right? So the AF's argument about removing military aid to authoritarian regimes in other countries, like for instance, Saudi Arabia, right? The US gives like a lot of weapons to them to fund their wars and stuff. Simply banning that or removing the military doesn't actually work because these private contractors just take up the assistance instead, right? So that's what this argument is saying. So after the claim, you have like the more specific warrant, and that is like essentially that PMCs aren't subject to legal constraints, right? You can see how that directly correlates to this sort of warrant in the card here, right? And you also are kind of pulling lines out of the card, like circumventing congressional authority through private status. The private status PMCs means they can be used to skirt congressional mandates. Like this is directly from the evidence that you find. So oftentimes your extensions have to be grounded in whatever evidence that you provide beforehand. And then following that up, you have the author name or the card name, right? So usually in extensions, right, you say your argument and then you say that's this like whatever author or evidence, right? Most of the time, like you can also say extend the Ghoul 06 evidence at the beginning. Banning military aid just allows us to be rerouted and then go into your explanation. But I think it's just easier to kind of like throw in the author name in the middle after you extend your sort of overall warrant and explanation so that the judge can kind of like write it down as like a reference, because again, like the most important part is your explanation, not the card name, right? So the last part after that then is just the implication, right? So the implication here is that it turns their specific contention about militarism, right? Because PMCs would then like create like more wars and violence than government aid would, okay? So I know that was like kind of dense. I know this example perhaps would be a little bit confusing, but does everyone see like the structure of how the extension works?
Would we prepare extensions beforehand or are they made up on the spot?
Yes, great question. So usually, right, especially when I think especially when you have cases that you're not as familiar with, I would write the extensions out beforehand so that you at least have some backup explanation to default to in your speech. Oftentimes, I think also extensions are just kind of like come up with like in the round itself, right? So if you're explaining your argument, naturally you do want to kind of still follow the structure, but your explanation will include these components anyways, right? But I will recommend, especially for like more advanced debaters, people oftentimes pre-write their extensions or they also write like perhaps what is called an overview of their contention or their argument or their disadvantage or just their overall like position that they're defending, right? And that explanation or overview, right, is going to include components of the extension, including like several cards, right, the warrants to them, how the argument all fits together, and the implication. Cool? That's a great question. Anyone else? Let's take let's take at least two more questions before we move on to weighing. While we're at it though, can we get like 1 to 5 in the chat for whether or not like how y'all feel about extensions?
I feel like the only thing we need now is like more experience actually doing this in round.
Yes, I agree. So the hope is that because we're having practice debates this afternoon, and we do have the parents, we're going to let you know about that probably directly after lab ends so that you have at least an hour to prepare or so during lunch and kind of just look through them. Honestly, everyone's reading the same case though, so it shouldn't be like like you shouldn't stress out too much. It's really just practice for everybody. So I hope that whatever we cover in this lab session, you'll be able to apply in your practice debates. Cool. So I think people are pretty much good on extensions. Would you all like to do like a quick practice? So like, I mean, we can like save this for later. Y'all can come back to this video later too. But if people want to like, just like do a quick practice for implications, does anyone have ideas for how this extension might apply? We can also just move on to Wayne. Like I'm not making people just, you know, think of arguments. Okay, any ideas for how this might apply, or should we just move on? I think most people are good, but again, we can like practice that in round 2, so it's okay if we just go to Wayne. Kelly, Shruti, do y'all want to add anything for extensions? Now we went pretty fast.
No, I think it's good. I think we can just see what they need to work on based on practice debates.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. All right, let's go to, yeah, I'm gonna put this PowerPoint up. So if y'all want to like look over it in lunchtime or anything, like feel free to, but like I know we have some other stuff we want to cover too in lab. So we're gonna go a little bit quickly today. So for Wayne, I think most people are kind of aware, but Wayne is really just why your argument or your impact matters more. Shruti or Kelly, do y'all want to just kind of explain the common Wayne mechanisms real quick?
I guess I can go. So, like these are the 4 common arguments for why your impact matters more. So the first one is magnitude. This is especially prevalent in arguments like when we were talking about yesterday, economic collapse, because it affects so many people and because it is like such a violent impact. Like it would cause like probably like the loss of like money or value to like thousands of people's of lives. So magnitude just says our impact is bigger because, or our impact is more important because it is the most severe. Oh, so just saying, like typically people extend probably 2 weighing mechanisms, but I think as long as you explain one, you can win. As long as you can explain why one, like if yours is the economic collapse scenario, as long as you explain like why its magnitude is heavier or like that, and that's why like if you impact it out and why like the magnitude being heavier means that your impact or your argument matters more, then like that is sufficient enough to win. But oftentimes like people extend more than one of these impacts or one of these mechanisms. So that's magnitude. Probability is like obviously like the probability that an event happens. This can be this one's pretty common because almost a lot of scenarios you can say like are very common. Like for example, like global warming, if you were like if the impact was global warming, you can see that it is very probable. Like science can prove that it is very probable to happen. Or if the impact is something more um like a what people call like soft left impacts, where the impact is just very, it is talking about like the oppression of a group of people or like systemic racism or something like that, you can obviously tell that it is very probable because it is happening like currently right now. So that can prove like 100% probability. The third one is time frame. So that just says at what point does your impact happen. This is also really common for, like I said, those types of soft left impacts because they're currently happening right now. But if you are one impact that is kind of big on magnitude, like severity, such as like economic collapse that we were talking about, that one may be a little harder to win time frame because a lot of times, or like global warming, that won't happen until a long time, or the full effects won't happen until a long time. And then cyclical violence, I think this one is also an impact, but I would kind of group magnitude, probability, and time frame into one category, and then cyclical violence into another, because this argument is not more of like a one-time event, but it just says that the event is reoccurring and I guess leads to like worse events. So it's kind of hard to describe it as a one-time thing like magnitude, probability, and time frame, but it just says that as the impact goes on and on, the impact becomes worse, if that makes sense.
Does it tie into probability? Like if it happened before, it can happen again?
Yeah, that's a good way to explain it. Probability is honestly just like, typically people go for probability for like those types of impacts that are already occurring. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions? Does anyone want to like add anything, Brian or Shruti?
No, that's good. I think these are, I think I'll definitely say that most people just kind of collapse all of these weighting mechanisms down to like the core three, right? So magnitude, probability, time frame. That's like the easiest way to think about weighing mechanisms, and really just the key questions you should be asking yourself when you're thinking about why does my impact or my argument matter more than my opponent's, right? So in every like rebuttal speech, like including like 1AR, probably even the 1NC, right? And of course the 2NR and 2AR in LD should all have some sort of weighing or argument or impact comparison. And that is going to usually utilize these mechanisms in regards to, is my impact more important because it's bigger, right? Is it more likely, or does it happen sooner or last longer, right? Cyclical violence, I think, the only distinction with that argument is that more oftentimes it's used in a little bit more like what we call like soft left affirmatives, which deal with structural violence or inequality, right? So that argument may be particularly relevant to this topic about violent revolutions, right? But it is also very relevant to affirmatives that talk about inequality or injustices, because oftentimes those are cyclical issues, and they occur like over and over, right? In contrast, right, magnitude, probability, time frame oftentimes apply to more utilitarian affirmatives or policy-based affirmatives that argue like this bad impact is going to happen now, right? So you'll be somewhat like surprised to see like how many people talk about like extinction or nuclear war or just like some sort of conflict breaking out because of this like one policy, right? But oftentimes a lot of policy debates and LD debates will engage in these sort of broader impact comparisons. And in those scenarios, usually magnitude, probability, and time frame take the most precedence. Cool. Questions about weighing mechanisms or how they might be used? Okay. I'm not going to talk too much about these. I honestly think that these weighing mechanisms are really just like a extension of the earlier ones you saw. But I think it's worth noting that some people, especially with like Lincoln Douglas debate, will kind of use like these other weighing mechanisms, right? They'll say like scope. Really, that's really just magnitude, I think. They'll say like their impact outweighs on specificity. I think that goes back to probability, right? But maybe like your impact is like more clear or specific. Sure, makes sense. And they also might say like reversibility, right? So like death outweighs poverty because poverty can be fixed later, death cannot be. You can't bring people back to life, you know? I also think that kind of goes back to magnitude in some sense. But just be aware that other people say these weighing arguments, and be aware that people say them so you can respond to them, okay? All right. I'm going to talk quickly about impact calculus and weighing comparison. So for, I think the general idea, people kind of already know, like, here are the core three weighing mechanisms, right? The other sort of tip that you kind of need to know is that people also weigh between weighing mechanisms. So they would say like, okay, is magnitude or probability more important, right? Is time frame more important than magnitude, right? If an impact is happening sooner, but it's not as big, like, do we care about it versus like an impact that is bigger but happening later? Like all of these kind of questions also come in when you're thinking about weighing, right? So this is a little bit more advanced for sure, but like a few examples might be like, okay, so magnitude of probability, right? If a pandemic is only having like a 1% chance of occurring, but could cause like human extinction, right? Should we research vaccine for that pandemic, or should we actually like, just like focus on like a flu outbreak, So like very pertinent with like the whole coronavirus situation, right? But for the most part, right, like I think there's a lot of debates to be had over different weighing mechanisms. So hopefully these are like a few examples. And of course, like we can return to this, but do people kind of get the idea of like what these weighing debates like look like? Thumbs up, reactions maybe, so I don't feel like I'm talking to myself. Okay.
Wait, will this PowerPoint slides be shared?
Yes, I'm gonna actually put it in the lab notes Google Drive folder that we have as on Google Classroom, I think. So y'all will be able to like revisit this as you wish. But I know like most people probably have some idea of extensions weighing already, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. And of course, if you have additional questions, you can always feel free to ask us directly. Also remember, like you can always private message us too, if you don't want to ask like outright, or like Kelly and Shruti or whoever is like not talking for like the next few like lectures or whatever, can also answer questions too if you answer in the chat. Okay. I'm going to talk very quickly about evidence comparison because I think it kind of fits under weighing. So as y'all probably remember from Shruti's like, I think it was during argumentation, right? Where she was talking about like what like sources and like the sort of like best like studies and statistics or experts to use in a debate would be. You can actually kind of make that debate and take that sort of initiative in regards to comparing which evidence is best based on like the sort of following methods, right? So the first, like most obvious one is just looking at the method of the study, right? So for statistics especially, you kind of want to look for like a study that perhaps combines evidence from other studies, right? So that could be like a meta-analysis or like just basically a very comprehensive study, right? You can look for trends, and whether or not they're predictive. And you can also look for studies that use like a control group or already are able to actually identify an internal warrant, as Daniel mentioned yesterday. So remember, like, having evidence that both has a statistical or empirical outcome and also perhaps an explanation of that outcome is better than simply just having a statistic and not knowing why that's true. In the same way, right, like for experts and like for people who are all qualified, but perhaps talking about an issue and having different perspectives, you can also use another mechanism to weigh between which evidence is better. And this is like qualifications, right, for the author. So for instance, like if I have an evidence that is saying violent revolutions is like effective in preventing like, I don't know, like oppression or something, or liberating people, right? And I had like an activist or like a revolutionary group talking about that, and the neg was like, no, like it's not successful, right? And their author was like a professor, right? And who is like studying these movements and stuff. You can kind of go with both sides, right? You can be like, well, my author's an activist. They would know like what things look like from the ground, right? Your professor does not have any experience. They're locked in the ivory tower. They're not actually like participating in these movements and these revolutions. So they don't have any firsthand experience. And that's more important because blah, 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 right? On the other hand, right, you could have the negative say, well, this professor has done a lot of studies, right? And first, like the methodology of the study has like more sample sizes and like just a broader scope than your one activist personal experience, right? And second, this professor also, I don't know, like it's better to like not use an activist standpoint because they could be biased about certain issues, So these are like different ways that you can evaluate evidence. The last three are just like relatively self-explanatory. So if evidence is more recent, right, usually that's going to be like more important or like more up to date, right? This is especially true for any arguments that are about current events. So you might hear later about like politics disads or disadvantages, which are basically arguments about a current bill in Congress or in the courts or like just any sort of legislation or judicial sort of like government decision, right? That is going to happen, and how like basically the affirmative happening right now would affect that. So all of those are very dependent on, okay, here are current events, here are current political issues, and those have to be very up to date, right? So evidence as more recent is going to definitely have the upper hand and perhaps take into account later or prior evidence. So that's like pretty also, like the main three are already like, you know, method of study, qualifications, and recency. Some people also argue like for specificity, if the evidence is just like a little bit more clear, more specific, that's good too. And causality, right? So think back to like the internal warrants that Daniel was talking about with like statistics. You want to make sure that your evidence is directly is directly indicating a causal effect between two variables or two things, right? Rather than just like a correlation. So it shouldn't be like, look, violent revolutions occurred at the same time as you know, like decolonial movements or like liberating you know, former colonies, right? You want to be like, look, it's not just correlation. In fact, violent revolutions caused this sort of decolonization and movements that, you know, were able to, like, for instance, free India from Britain or something. Does that all make sense? I know, again, this was pretty quick, but just like some things to keep in mind when you're weighing evidence too. Can we get 1 to 5 on weighing, please? Okay, great. Shruti, Kelly, do y'all want to add anything? Do you want to talk about flows real quick if there's no questions?
Yeah, I'll say some things about flows. If y'all have any questions, just like feel free to interrupt me or like put it in the chat. But I've looked through all of your flows. I think overall you did a great job. I think all of you are going in the right direction, especially in terms of just being able to write down all the arguments and be able to reference them in later debates. A few things to work on for everyone are, first of all, spacing. I know it might seem excessive and you might be like, oh, I can fit it in, I can just write smaller, but you should always err on the side of putting more space in between arguments than less space in between arguments. I noticed for some of y'all, you spaced out like your handwriting pretty evenly so that it was still easy to read, but you didn't put spaces in between like contention 1 and contention 2, or between like the framework and contention 1. That's really important because especially as debates get faster and as you get older, some people will just read a lot of arguments against one contention or a lot of arguments against the framework, and you don't want to run out of space to write these arguments. So I think the rule of like my coach told me was like you should try and put a thumb space or like a finger space in between each of the arguments. So try doing something like that just so you make sure that you're consciously keeping up an effort to space things out. And then the other thing was abbreviations. I think everyone can be using a lot more abbreviations, especially for common terms in the topic like violent or nonviolent or violent revolution, or like I saw a lot of y'all wrote out like effectiveness word for word. I think that was one of the contentions. So just like be looking for places where you can make things shorter because it makes it easier for yourself. But yeah, overall, y'all did a great job. So I'm excited to see what the practice debates look like.
Yeah, for sure. I think like we're gonna go into plans and disadvantages and probably counter plans next, with like more progressive arguments. So let's take a 5-minute break, and if everyone could come back at 10:50, we'll get started pretty promptly. And of course, if you have questions, like feel free to stick around a little bit. But I'm gonna go get some water too. Sound good? Cool.
Oh wait, so can I ask a question real quick?
Mhm.
Yeah, okay. So especially in traditional debate formats, when the opponents are saying like they're 1 and C against the app argument, is it more like evidence-based that they're using evidence to disprove their opponent's arguments, or it's more like logic and more based on like philosophy and then like proving out their points through logic?
Do you mean like, so in more traditional debates, do they like rely more on like just logical arguments rather than evidence?
Yeah.
Yes. So I would say that in general, if you're in like a more traditional round, right, the focus is less on the evidence or like the research, right, but more about like what each debater says. So that will usually be more analytical arguments, meaning more arguments that are just less about like, okay, here's what the author or the card says, right, but more just like, here's what the resolution is about and like why we are winning the round. Of course, like, you know, any debate, right, should have a good balance between evidence and analysis. But I will say that, like, especially for traditional rounds, right, there's more focus on persuasion and making sure the judge is just like, you know, understanding and appealing to them.
Okay.
Okay. Bridget, do you have a question too? Okay, perfect. I'll be back in just a second. As y'all are coming back, if you could turn on your camera on again, please, that would be great, just so we know you're here. All right, let's go ahead and get started again. Let me share my PowerPoint real quick. So, where's my mouse? I lost it. Okay, great. just gonna close this. All right, so let's dive into more policy and progressive arguments. I will note that in Lincoln Douglas debate, a lot of the arguments that you will see in a little bit more like advanced debates or national circuit level debates are going to be arguments from policy debate. So there's like a lot of like, jargon and just like types of arguments that you might hear, like plans, counterplans, disads, critiques, theory, like all of these like sort of very like abstract arguments that are really just like labels for types or structures of certain arguments, right? And we're going to try and break that down a little bit. So you can kind of think of this as like, I don't know if y'all like kind of know a little bit about like debate history, I suppose, but like policy debate is like the great like grandfather of like debates. And like that's like all of the sort of like very fast and also just like where all of the arguments kind of come from, right? So the trickle down is from like college policy. They kind of like do all of the like cool arguments and have like the more innovative stuff that trickles down to high school policy. And then from policy, right, that goes to like LD, and then LD kind of goes to PF, or like policy goes to PF. But like by that time, like the arguments are just like so diluted or just like not like as great as they once were, right? So in LD debate, a lot of the understanding that you'll need actually comes from more policy style arguments. And these arguments we usually refer to as like live action role playing or LARP, which I hate that word, but that is what people call it. So these arguments are really just meaning that LDers or debaters, right, are role playing policy makers or policy debaters by borrowing arguments from that activity, and also borrowing perhaps like just like imagining yourself as a policymaker, right, passing a certain plan or conducting like some sort of an action that has to do with the resolution, and therefore debating whether or not the resolution is a good idea if it were to actually happen, right? So with that, Shruti, do you want to talk like really quickly about like framing and just like what that looks like in LD? Because I know there's like more utilitarian framing, but people probably also want to know a little bit about like deontology or other frameworks maybe.
Okay, so I guess this goes back to the discussion we were having yesterday about frameworks. Like I said, a framework is a lens through which you view the debate. Specifically for policy arguments, Brian's right that most of the time it's going to be some kind of consequentialist or utilitarian framework, which basically just means that they care about actions that impact the most people or actions that maximize the most well-being for the most number of people. So that's why these debates are usually about big scale impacts like economic collapse or about war or extinction, things like that. On the other hand, in LD, we also have more philosophical type arguments like Kant and like Locke. Oh my God, why am I buzzing? Sorry. And these arguments fall under a bucket called deontology, which means we focus more on like treating people as means in and of themselves rather than just seeing them as a means to an end. So what I mean here is that utilitarianism is solely focused on the consequences. It doesn't really matter how I reach that action, it just matters what the consequences look like. On the other hand, deontology cares very much about the process and also cares about like whether or not things are right in and of itself, regardless of the consequence. So like, I guess without getting too deep here, because we don't have a ton of time to focus on just deontology, like we can talk more about this later. Essentially, you should think of deontology as very like rights-based, and it focuses more on how people have these like intrinsic, unalienable rights that you cannot violate, even if it is for a good consequence, and things like that. Not sure how detailed I should get, especially since we're about to talk.
I think that's good. Yeah.
But basically, our point that we're trying to make here, like, we can talk more about deontology and give you a more detailed rundown later. But basically, like, people will frame arguments in different ways to try and exclude people's offense. So something that you might see if you're reading like policy arguments or plan-based arguments is that someone will read some kind of like counter framework against you with like deontology in it, and it'll say like none of your large impacts matter because we should focus on this like rights-based process instead. So that's something to keep in mind and consider if you're reading policy arguments. And then if you're debating policy arguments and you want to learn more about philosophy, it's a great way to exclude most of their offense.
Yeah, exactly. Great. So I think this was already kind of addressed, but yeah, so for most policy arguments, use a consequentialist framework. I will say like the evidence packet frameworks that we've kind of provided you are a little bit mix of both. Like you can kind of take like the human equality framework in the consequentialist direction, in the sense that, you know, violent revolutions would promote like liberation or good consequences, right, for oppressed groups. But at the same time, there's also like a little bit of, I suppose, like vagueness that allows you to access like more deontological frameworks as well. And that's why the contention is about like Locke and the social contract, in the sense that there is a moral sort of justice in regards to allowing oppressed groups to like reformulate their relationship to the government who has broken the social contract, right? So kind of think about how you can kind of take the debate both ways. The cases were kind of set up intentionally so that you can also think a little bit more about framework and also interact on the framework debate as well. Same thing with like the democratic principles argument, that can evidently be like more consequences based, you know, as like you might expect, because with the card in there about how consequences matter, you probably want to look at the outcomes, right? But also, if you really wanted to, you can also include some offense that is more rights-based or deontological in nature as well. So just good things to keep in mind. We're going to talk kind of about like just how the resolution relates to a plan or a counter plan. So I kind of want to just clarify that like resolutions are usually a very sort of broad topic, right? So the debate centers around like violent revolutions and whether they're a just response to political oppression, right? But underneath that, there's a lot of different categories, right? So you might have like, okay, what about violent revolutions specifically for this country, or for maybe for violent revolution in response to racism, right? Or a specific type of political oppression, right? So all of that are kind of subsets, right, of this broader resolution. And that's where we kind of have plans or counter plans. So a plan or a counter plan is really just an idea that usually stems from the resolution, and usually narrowing that a little bit in scope. So you can kind of think of this as like the resolution or the topic being a larger box, right? So you have a box on like all four sides, and the plan is really just like a subset of this box. So within this box, there are a lot of other plans that you could do, right? For this topic, it might be like, okay, the box is violent revolutions. Like one side of the box is like political oppression. So the violent revolution must be in response to political oppression. The other side is like violent, you know? So we're not including like non-violent revolutions, obviously, right? And that kind of sets up the parameters of what lies in the scope of the topic or in the scope of the resolution. And within this box, we have then other plans, right? So we have perhaps a plan that's like violent revolution is justified in response to colonial oppression, you know? Or we could have like another affirmative that's like violent revolution is justified in response to political oppression in like Algeria or something. I don't know. Like just like kind of think about like these more specific advocacies or plans that still fall within the scope of the resolution, okay? So that kind of brings me to what a plan actually is. If you think about a plan, right, it's really just a specific action or set of actions that supports the resolution, right? So most plan texts are going to be like a single sentence. They're going to be referred to as like an advocacy, and there will almost always be some sort of parametricized version of the resolution, meaning parametricized, like, you know, parameter, right? So I think most people would see that as like just a more specific subset of the topic, right? So the plan can address some idea that falls within the parameters of the topic, but it is not the whole topic. Does that all make sense so far? Questions?
Oh, I think I want to just bring up one thing. So
Yeah.
Brian, he was talking about like plans and counterplans, and like he did an amazing job. But I think that plans like must follow the resolution, while counterplans don't always have to follow the resolution.
Yeah, for sure.
The counterplans, what they are supposed to do is they're supposed to like solve the AF, and that it kind of solves the AF's impacts, but it doesn't have to do it in a resolutional context. Does that make sense?
Wait, so are plans only used by the negating side, or is it also used by the AF?
Kelly, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so plans are always used by the AF. So plans are just like the AF team, you know how we always like they always have that app that they have to read. Like typically, like every round they read like, oh, maybe the same app, maybe a different app. The plan would just be the advocacy within that app. So in the starter packet, the app has is talking about like violent revolutions and like framework and stuff like that. The plan would be what they advocate as a result of all of that types of framework. So the AF team always reads a plan, but the negating team does not always have to read a counter plan, but the negating team does not read a plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to clarify that too, I will say like in LD, right, technically every advocacy is a plan, but like more commonly, right, for the cases that we've given you, they're not necessarily considered plans because a plan is usually thought of as a more specific action that is part of the resolution, right, but not all of the resolution. So in the evidence packets case, right, because the advocacy or the resolution is simply violent revolution is a just response to political oppression, and that is the whole advocacy, right? You're not really reading a plan per se because you're not specifying a certain parameter within the topic, right? So a plan that you could potentially read is like violent revolution is a just response to structural, like, I don't know, like colonial oppression in like X country, right? So that would be obviously part of the topic, right? Colonial oppression is a type of political oppression, maybe, and you know, like this country is obviously part of this like broader statement about violent revolutions overall, right? But it's not the whole topic. So usually plans are going to be a subset of the resolution. For the cases we've given you, those are typically called whole res cases, which are whole resolution cases, right? So those are defending the entirety of the resolution rather than just a specific part of the resolution. And that's the difference with plans. It's that if the affirmative reads a plan, right? If I say violent revolution is justified in response to political oppression in Algeria, right? Then if the negative is like, well, what about like violent revolution in Iran? That would be horrible. It would lead to like terrorism and like more violence, right? And the affirmative is like, well, I agree, right? Like we're talking about Algeria. Why are you talking about Iran? You know, so it kind of narrows the scope of their advocacy to be more specific, and it makes them a little bit more strategic because they don't have to defend the entirety of the resolution. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I have a question. Can't the negative side, like the refuting side, can't they just use like theory debate and say like that they're reducing clash and stuff?
Yes, so that is a very good point. We're going to hopefully get into theory later in lab, but yes, there are arguments in debate that contest the theoretical validity of plans, right? So if somebody is like, look, we're not going to defend the whole resolution, right? We only defend violent revolutions in Algeria, right? And the negative is like, well, that seems very arbitrary, right? Like it seems like you're just excluding all of our arguments about Iran or about like, you know, other countries, etc., right? And then they could be like, this is abusive. You should lose because you're trying to avoid a clash in education about other areas of the topic, right? So yes, there is some contestation over whether or not plans are theoretically legitimate, right? But for the most part, people, especially like more progressive judges and like policy debaters for sure, are very accepting and tolerant towards reading a more specific plan that specifies part of the resolution. Cool?
The other thing I will say is like, don't let yourself be scared of theory. Like if you really want to read a plan or read a certain argument, like just prepare a defense against theory. Like most of the time, a lot of the plan's bad arguments are kind of lazy and people will just throw it in there and they won't be well warranted out. So if you want to read a plan, just prepare something that says plans are good against theory.
Yeah, that's a great point too. We'll talk about theory for sure, hopefully in the upcoming labs. But I will say like theory is just another argument, you know, it's not like different in any sense. Maybe it is more of an argument about debate and whether or not your actions are justified in the debate context, right? But at the end of the day, it's still an argument and you can be back arguments. Cool?
Oh, I just had one more thing to say. So if you look in the starter packet, and if you look just like at the affirmative case, so the plan in this instance would be like, I stand resolved. Violent revolution is is a just response to political oppression, because that's the advocacy that that's what you're advocating for in the AF. And then the contentions, like the contention 1 and 2, are kind of like the reasons why you're advocating for the plan.
Yeah, exactly. So I will say that in regards to like more traditional versus progressive debates, right? The cases that we have provided for everyone would lie definitely on the more traditional side. That means that there is like, you know, more focus on here's like the framework, right? Here's the definitions, here's the quotes, right? It is whole resolution, right? It's not a specific action that narrows the scope of the resolution, right? And the contentions that are laid out, right, are a little bit more like here are the subpoints, right? Here are the general sort of ideas. So these are stock cases, right? Meaning that they don't necessarily have all the components that a typical plan affirmative would have. And that's what we're actually going to get to right now. But just keep in mind that the cases that we've given you are not plan affirmatives. So although they have an advocacy statement, and Kelly is right, that the I stand resolved part, violent revolutions are just response to political oppression, that part is your advocacy, right? But it is not necessarily reflective of what a plan aff would look like. And I'm actually, I'm going to hopefully show an example of what a plan affirmative might look like after this, okay? Cool. Do Kelly or Shruti, do y'all want to talk about this part for the acronym HITS and like just components of a plan aff? Or should we keep? I can't actually see anyone because.
I'm trying to talk about it.
Okay.
Okay. So these are all of the different parts of a plan. So every time that you read a plan, you should make sure that you include these things in your affirmative. It makes a nice little acronym for you too that Brian spelled out, HITS. So just remember that. And also when you're contesting plans, you should run through this acronym in your head and see if your opponent has included every single part of the plan. And if they haven't, you should definitely point it out because it's probably a big like detriment to their strategy. So first we'll start off with harms. So harms essentially is what is the like big bad thing in the status quo that the plan is trying to fix. So for this topic, we could say something like, I don't know, like oppressive regimes or dictatorships. Like that is really bad in the status quo. There's a lot of human rights violations, and that's the main issue that the plan is trying to address. So harms is just kind of like the bad thing that you're going to try to fix later on. Inherency goes into harms a little bit more specifically, but it's basically describing what is happening right now in the status quo and what can change. So the harm we identified was like human rights violations because of dictatorships. For inherency, we could say something like, well, in this specific country, the dictator is cracking down and doing more and more human rights violations and like putting activists in jail in the status quo. So inherency is a description of what is going on right now and what can change. The reason why inherency is important is because people will sometimes try and contest your inherency. Like if your plan is not inherent, it basically means that, actually, wait, let's back up really fast. So when you're affirmative, the thing that affirmatives propose is usually a change from the status quo. Like they have to make some kind of change to what is going on right now. So any plan basically is proposing a policy that will change what is happening right now. So if you read an affirmative that proposes a policy that has already happened or tries to address something that has already gone away, then your affirmative is not inherent. So if I say like, in this specific country right now, human rights violations are really bad, and I propose this plan to solve it, let's say that's actually not true. Let's say another country like intervened and the dictator is gone and there's no more human rights violations. My plan would not be inherent because that change in the status quo is no longer happening. Like that change has already occurred, someone has already fixed the problem, so my plan doesn't actually resolve anything. So this is definitely something that you should watch out for, because if your opponent reads an aff or a plan that's not inherent, like something has already fixed it or something has already resolved it, it's definitely something you should point out because it's basically a reason to vote for you because their argument is now the status quo. Does that make sense to everyone? If there's any questions, like feel free to interrupt or just put it in the chat. And you can always message us privately. Okay, so inherency basically you should think of as a description of what is happening right now, what are you trying to change? Then the next part is topicality. So topicality, we can talk more about the theoretical justifications behind topicality more later when we do the theory discussion. But essentially, topicality just means that your plan needs to reference the topic in some way or talk about the topic in some way, and that you should have some kind of defenses for why that plan is topical. So if I were to read an AF that was like, we should do like non-violent revolutions in a specific country, I can say that that plan is topical because I'm talking about violent revolutions in response to political oppression in a specific context or like of a specific country. But if I were to read an AF, sorry, I really have no other examples besides this, but if I were to read an AF that was like dogs are better than cats, obviously that's not about violent revolutions. And so I would probably encounter some kind of topicality questions there. Obviously, like these kinds of debates will be a little more nuanced. Like no one's going to stand up and read like dogs are better than cats. But like, for example, I remember one topic I debated, we were debating something about like housing policies and like land use policies. And someone read this AF that was like land requisitions or like the government seizing land. But the way that the topic described housing was really in the context of like the private sector. So the government seizing land didn't apply. So that AF was actually not topical under like a common definition of the topic because it was outside of the like purview of what the topic was discussing. So we'll definitely talk more about topicality. So if you're confused right now, like let us know the questions, but also keep in mind that we'll talk about it during the theory lecture, but you should think of it is your plan like related to the topic? Are you discussing the topic? Then the next thing is significance. So you can think of this as like what you would put in your contentions usually. So for plans, we would call it something like probably like an advantage, and a significance would be the impact of those advantages. So significance just means what good thing does your plan do? So it's like it solves violent revolution and resolves human rights abuses, something like that. Or like it resolves economic collapse. So the significance is that we prevent human rights violations, we prevent like economic destruction, things like that. The other thing is that when you think about your significance, you should also think about the weighing mechanism. So if I were to read a plan where I'm trying to stop something like human rights violations, that impact might not necessarily be as good if someone reads an extinction impact against me in a magnitude debate, because they could argue like, well, everyone dying would obviously have a much, much larger magnitude. And like there's arguments that you can contest against that, but you should think about your advantages with the weighing mechanism. Especially for using things like probability, you can say like, look, we have evidence of human rights violations right now. It's highly probable that these are going to continue and get worse. Your extinction scenario is really, really improbable because so many things would have to happen for like that extinction scenario to pan out. So based on the kinds of advantages that you have and the kind of significance that you're going for, you can think about what specific weighing mechanisms work well with your advantage. So in this case, it would be probability, and you can leverage it in like probability versus magnitude debates. And then the last part of the plan is solvency. So this is essentially you have to be able to resolve whatever harm you bring up. So if I bring up the human rights violations under like happening in a specific country right now, my plan has to actually be able to fix those things. Otherwise, it's not actually offense for me. So if I can't prove that my AF makes things better, I don't win the debate because I haven't done anything to fix the problems that I've identified. So that's what solvency is. So it's some kind of card that will be like doing the plan, like doing a violent revolution would actually resolve X issue. So you try and find some evidence that says that your plan would work. One thing to keep in mind here is the solvency advocate. Actually, does anyone know what a solvency advocate is? Does anyone want to take a crack at guessing what they think it is? You can like say it out loud or put it in the chat. It's okay if you guess. Okay, I'll let y'all off the hook for this one, but for the next question, more people should try and answer. Solvency advocate is kind of what it sounds like. It's basically someone that says that doing the plan would be a good idea. So it is literally someone that is advocating for your plan and says that it would actually work. So let's say like Professor Brian, he writes some article that's like, oh yeah, doing a violent revolution in this country would definitely work and would resolve the human rights violations. He would be considered a solvency advocate for my plan because he's written that it's a good idea and that he thinks it'll work. For plans, I guess we kind of got into the theory discussion, but one of the ways that you can leverage your plan, your specific plan against theory, is by saying that you have a solvency advocate that is grounded in the topic literature. which means it's an author that they should know about, that they should be prepared for, that they should read. So your plan isn't exactly theoretically bad. We can talk more about the specifics of that debate either, but just like remember what the term solvency advocate means and then make sure you leverage it if you have a plan. So yeah, in the cases where you're trying to specify countries, having someone that advocates for doing that plan in that specific country would be considered a solvency advocate. Yeah, is there anything anyone wants to add or any questions?
Wait, I'm still confused what you mean by solvency advocate. Because like right below it says that means your harms can't be so huge. So they're just saying like your the harms that your plan is trying to solve has to be like solvable.
Okay, yeah, so that's unrelated to solvency advocate. They're two separate bullets. The third point is just a point about solvency. Basically, like, I can't just have some random giant impact that's like, I don't know, let's say I say that I'm going to prevent like the next alien invasion or something like that. Something really random. Like, that would be such a huge and vague impact that I wouldn't necessarily be able to prove that I resolve with my plan. So you have to make sure that you have solvency specific to what your plan does, because it gives your plan more legitimacy. And then the difference between what I'm saying there about what solvency does and the solvency advocate is that the solvency advocate is an author that says that doing your plan is a good idea and would work. So you can think of it as someone who's basically writing your solvency evidence, like someone out there in the field who is contributing to that and says that your plan would work. Does that make more sense?
Yeah.
If it doesn't, if you still have a question, like let me know. We should resolve it now. Okay, yeah, just remember like solvency advocate is a person, someone in the field. Solvency says that the plan works.
Any questions? Let's take at least like 2 before we move on, because I know this is not easy.
Yeah, like we don't expect you to understand it 100% yet. So if you've got any questions or anything you want us to go over again, just let us know.
And we're not moving on without 2 questions.
Can everyone actually do the 1 to 5 thing again for plans?
Okay, I'm seeing a lot of 4s. Like, is there anything you want us to go over again? Like, help us make the 4 into a 5?
Could you like thumbs up if you've heard of like plans and just like each part of a plan before? Okay, so that's 2 people. So there should definitely be questions. I have to start picking on some people.
What's the difference between a plan and an observation?
Shruti or Kelly, do you want to take that?
Sure. So essentially, observation is the name that people will, well, I've seen it used in 2 different ways. The more common way, and the way that comes from policy, is that people will label their contentions or their advantages with the term like observation, and that'll be like the label for their contention. The other way I've seen it used is people will try and like flag things that they want to point out. Like sometimes in LD, people will like call out their inherency this way, or they'll call out like some statement about the status quo with the term observation. So it's kind of like round dependent or like case by case. But essentially the difference between that and a plan is the observation would probably be calling out like a specific argument, and the plan would be what you're advocating for in the entire round. So all of your arguments or observations would stem from your plan. Does that make more sense? Yeah, people are kind of inconsistent about how they use observation. So
Observations, advantages, contentions, like it's honestly a lot of them kind of merge together. As long as you know like the core components of a plan F, you should be able to identify whatever they call it. Even if they don't label anything, like you should be like, okay, I know that these 2 or 3 cards are the harms, these other 2 are the solvency advocate or plan, this other card is like a, you know, like a response to topicality, like etc. Right? So if you keep this acronym in mind, you'll be able to kind of categorize the components of a plan, even if they like mislabel or call it something different. Great question. Can we get 1 or 2 more maybe?
I have like a general question about plans.
Yeah.
On the AF side, why is it more beneficial to run a plan rather than just advocating for the AF directly? Or just arguing the AF directly? Because, I don't know, I've never seen anyone actually run a plan on the AF.
We can definitely like assign like maybe like a debate to watch that you might perhaps benefit from observing. But the short answer is that if you have a plan that allows you to kind of narrow the scope of the debate, right? So the example I gave earlier, right? If I'm only talking about violent revolution in Algeria, right? I don't have to worry about arguments about violent revolution in Iran or Chad or like elsewhere or whatever. So if that's the case, right? The plan allows you to first choose the grounds of the debate so that it's more strategic for your side, you know, and you're more prepared about this specific area to defend. And second, to exclude certain parts of negative arguments that do not apply to your specific advocacy.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Great question.
It's actually useful in LD because a lot of the topics, like they won't specify United States or United States federal government like they do in policy. Like once I had a topic that was like countries should prohibit the production of nuclear power. So like literally every country in the world. So having a plan lets you narrow the debate more strategically. So if your opponent brings up like counter arguments or counter examples from other countries, you won't necessarily have to be responsible for those. So
Oh, interesting. But in that case, would your plan be to just argue about, you know, whatever, like nuclear power in the United States?
Yeah, or you could do like nuclear power in India, there was like nuclear power in China, like Russia, like people would just pick different countries. And usually like people just can't pick a random country. Like, I don't know, if I were to pick some random, like very tiny country that doesn't have a nuclear program, there's probably not going to be anyone that writes about it or has enough evidence about why prohibiting nuclear power there is good. So depending on the topic, you'll know like what are the big areas or who are the big countries and the big players. And so you'll know like what plans will people be reading.
I'm going to go ahead and just show a quick example of a plan affirmative. So this is a relatively older file, but this topic was about the right to be forgotten, which is in essence like the right to kind of have your information or whatever deleted from Google searches and internet searches. So for instance, like if I was like a criminal felon when I was like 20 or whatever, right? And all that information is available on the web. I would be able to petition to have like my like criminal record or like certain parts at least of information that's negative about me, which is preventing me from, for instance, getting a job to be deleted after like, you know, X amount of time or whatever. So that's like in essence what the kind of phrase right to be forgotten is. Don't focus too much on the topic though, just kind of pay attention to the structure. So here I'm just going to show a quick example of what the structure of this affirmative looks like. So you have clearly like a framework, right? So regardless of whether you read a plan or like a typical case with the whole resolution, you still have to have a framework, right? So especially in Lincoln-Douglas debate, this first card, this first section is what we would refer to as like a syllogism, right? A syllogism is really just a logical justification for what the standard or valid criterion, those two are the same, should be. So in this case, right, it is a utilitarianism framework. The standard or valid criterion is maximizing expected well-being. And the first two cards are like why maximizing expected well-being is important. So I'm not going to go too into detail there. These two are additional reasons to prefer the valid criterion, right? And why that's important. So all of these are like more support for a utilitarianism framework. So additional reason to prefer. Here we have the inherency. This is basically why the current data protection framework does not give users control over their data and also allows like misuse of the data. So that's why we need a right to be forgotten, right? And is also why the affirmative is necessary in order to address like the current sort of legal issues that allow for the harms to occur. So here we have the plan, which is just the advocacy. To be honest, I forgot the exact text of the resolution, but I will say that like this is a little bit more specific than just like if the resolution was the United States ought to recognize the right to be forgotten from internet searches, right? I'm pretty sure fairly common to add like a phrase at the end or something, but this affirmative seems to have added the phrase as a civil right at the end because, you know, potentially there are different rights, right? You could have like human right, a civil right, you know, like all those kind of things. So that is specified here. Did someone else have something to add?
It didn't specify civil right. What it specified was United States and federal government. Yeah, it specified a country basically.
Okay, well that makes sense. Yeah, like that would make more sense because I don't know if that was actually in the resolution, but yeah. If it specifies a country, that's even more important because otherwise it's just like really, really broad. The advantage here, and we can talk a little bit about the structure of an advantage, right? But think about like essentially here, right? This is essentially a description of the status quo. This is what we will call uniqueness. We'll talk more about this when we get to disadvantages, but the typical structure of an advantage, right, is going to be here's the harms, right? This is what's happening in the status quo that creates the harms of why we need like this sort of issue, right? And specifically here, it's talking about how the right to be forgotten is a key point of the US-EU free trade agreement. This is like additional, like this is essentially like a link for why the right to be forgotten must be complied with by the United States in order to have good trade relations with Europe and the EU. So that is the link to the topic, if you think about it. And then we would also, I think, refer to this last card as like the significance, right? Which is the impact on why this contention is important. And here's like, so ignore like the whole like acronyms and stuff, but basically this argument is saying that the right to be forgotten and recognizing that on the US's part is going to lead to better European Union cooperation, better transatlantic alliances, and those are necessary to prevent global war, okay? Questions up to this point? Okay, I saw some in the chat. This is a second advantage really quickly. I'm not gonna go through all of that. Last thing I wanna just show really quickly though, before I answer a few questions is the solvency. So here is like just a whole section for like why the right to be forgotten is necessary, and also like why there are like why the US is able to implement it in a certain sense. All right, I see some questions. I just don't know where they are. Okay, questions, please. Structure.
Oh, okay. I have a question. So how would we, as like, if we were on the opposing side, how would we respond to certain plans? Like if we were preparing to defend against the entire argument, but they chose somewhere that we didn't prepare for?
Shruti or Kelly, do you want to take this? I feel like I've talked too much.
Okay, sure. Or Kelly, did you want to go? I saw you unmute.
Oh, well, the only thing that I wanted to say was that most of your like generic like counter plans and dissats are still going to apply. They might not apply as much if the plan doesn't defend the United States, but the plan, because it has to be about violent revolutions, like most of your like generic stuff is still going to apply because most of your generic stuff are about violent revolutions too, even if it's not as specific to the plan.
Yeah, so that's definitely true. You can apply like the arguments that you already have and make it specific to the plan. One way to take that even further is if you find evidence specific to whatever country they defend, like let's say I'm defending like the US or something for this topic, they could find evidence about why the right to be forgotten in the US would be uniquely bad. And so that would make your disadvantages or whatever arguments you're reading a little more specific. You could also read a counterplan, especially if they specify a country, like it'll give you, I guess, more of an ability to do like a different policy within that country or do a different approach within that country. You could also contest like the topicality of the plan. If like, let's say the resolution references like more than one country, like it uses the term countries plural, but they've only specified one, you could argue that they have to defend more than one country, which we'll talk about more when we talk about like topicality in theory. But yeah, I mean, Kelly's absolutely right that you can apply the arguments that you already have and talk about them in the context of their plan. And you can also do a little more work to find evidence specific to whatever they're defending, especially if it's a major country on the topic like the US.
Other questions? If not, we can pull up the PowerPoint. Other questions? Let's take one more before we move on to disadvantages. Anyone confused about the parts of a plan F maybe? Oh, I'm sorry. We have, when is, okay. All right, so electives, I almost forgot elective starts at 11:45 and not 12 today. So let's go ahead and just like call it a day for plans. Let's also, however, answer some questions if there's any more. In the meantime, though, I need everyone to, I hope everyone already like signed up for electives. I think that is everyone, but I'm gonna send out a lab survey for people to fill out real quick in just regards to the homework, the pace of lab instruction, anything else you wanna work on, as well as like whether or not we should have a camp tournament. So please make sure to fill that out during your next like time period or whatever, like just before like our next lab session. And then I will also have pairings sent out on the Google Classroom. Okay, so let me show that actually really quickly so that y'all at least know what side you're on. Oopsies, not this one.
What side for the mock debates?
Yes,
Or-
so for the practice debate today, yeah. I will say like for people who are flight 1, those are going to start at 2 o'clock. So Kelly, Brian, me, Daniel, and then like we're gonna judge those. And then for flight 2, that's gonna probably start at 3 o'clock, maybe 3:15. Cool. And just like the people who are not debating in a given flight will be flowing whichever debate that they're also watching. So for this case, right, I will put you 5 in a breakout room, and then Marianne and Vincent, if you could flow the first debate, maybe even offer some feedback, right, or just like kind of have an idea of like what you might be able to learn from that debate. And then like after that, like Marianne and Vincent will debate, and then Albert and Salim can watch and also flow. Cool.
Wait, I'm confused. Where do we find our groupings?
Oh, I am not sharing them. I apologize. I thought I was. Thank you for letting me know.
Confused. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, here. Can everyone see it now?
Yes.
Okay, my apologies. So again, everyone here is affirmative. Everyone here is negative. You'll also know if you're flight 1 or flight 2. Cool. If you don't have any, yeah.
We just use the practice case that you shared with us.
Yes. So all of the like evidence and like the homework that you highlighted for those cases, you can use for these debates, and we prefer you do that actually. Of course, if you have like other cards and stuff that you cut, like feel free to use that in round. Cool. If there's no other questions, y'all can feel free to stick around. We can answer some more, but if not, like I know a break would be good before elective, so you're free to go.
Thank you.
Wait, so I just have like one question, but basically, when from what I've experienced with like progressive debates, debaters talk like super duper fast. So in traditional debates, would you say like it's a lot more slower and like a constant speaking
Yeah,
rate?
for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so like traditional debates, I think just emphasize like more on persuasion and at most like a conversational, maybe faster than conversational pace. I will say like for more like progressive debaters and policy debaters especially, they will like speak at like relatively like incomprehensive rates for your typical people. So like when they spread, right, like or speed read an argument, it will usually be like very much for the purpose of getting through as many arguments as they can. And also like, you know, it's just a kind of like a practice that people all do. So the judges understand it, the debaters also understand it. It's just something you have to kind of get used to. Yeah.
So usually in tournaments, when they do have LD and like they give out the resolutions, is it more like towards the progressive side, or are most like LD debates at tournaments traditional?
It really depends on where you're competing. I'd say like a lot of like local tournaments, especially if you aren't going to like very, very large tournaments or national tournaments, are going to be more traditional. But for like prominent tournaments, especially like national circuit or TOC qualifying tournaments, like all of those like larger tournaments that attract a lot of different people will usually be more progressive. So that would be like, you know, like common tournaments for LD would be like St. Mark's, Green Hill, Apple Valley, like Berkeley, Harvard. Just like kind of like if you look on Tab Room and you kind of like scroll through that, you'll probably see like larger tournaments.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you.
Of course. Other questions?
Kind of leeching off of Salim's question. For today's practice debate, then, do you want us to talk slower or a little faster?
Whatever you're comfortable with. Like I was thinking like most people are probably going to talk a little bit slower, but like you should also, everyone should time the cases beforehand to see like how long it takes them. If you have to speak faster, like obviously like we'll understand it, like that's fine. Just make sure you're clear.
Yeah, like definitely don't try and force yourself to go fast just for the sake of going fast. You should always try and be more clear than be fast because you want to make sure that your judge understands as many arguments as possible.
Anything else? Okay, y'all are good to go. Electives start in like 5 minutes. Does anyone have other like questions? People know what elective they're going to.
Oh yeah, how do we figure out which elective we're going to again? I forgot which one I said.
Sage, you are going to, I don't think you signed up actually. So if you
I looked back at the form and it said that I had already responded.
let me see. Oh, I'm sorry. You're on Research Hacks with Kelly.
All right.
Let's go. I'm so excited.
Yeah. Kelly, you've got 17 people at yours.
Bro, I'm so excited. We're about to have so much fun, everyone.
Yeah.
Signed up.
Looking forward to it.
All right.
Okay, bye. Thank you.